They say your golden years are for gardening, peace, and watching birds fight over breadcrumbs. But the morning Karen marched into my backyard with a clipboard and a self-righteous glare, I realized retirement was just a long, slow war with petty tyrants in yoga pants. I was sitting on my porch swing, sipping coffee, when I saw her, flanked by two HOA cronies like she was leading a neighborhood military raid. I didn't even get a good morning, just a, Frank, we'll need to remove that rose trellis by Saturday. It obstructs the archway. I blinked. Then she dropped the real bomb. We'll be hosting my niece's wedding here next weekend. I've already sent the invites. Now, I'm 67 years old, but I'm not senile, nor am I spineless. I stared at her, trying to decode if this was a poorly delivered joke or an actual mental breakdown happening in real time. Karen, I said slowly, this is my backyard. She looked genuinely baffled, like I was the one who'd gotten lost. Yes, Frank, but you have the best view in the whole neighborhood. We all agreed it's the perfect venue. I took another sip of coffee. Who's we? Did the squirrels get a vote? She ignored the question. It's for love, Frank. Don't be selfish. The HOA, Homeowners Association, or as I like to call it, the Hysterical Overlord's Army. I've lived in this neighborhood for 34 years, and in that time, I've seen 3 HOA presidents come and go. Karen took tyranny to a new level. This woman once fined me $50 for having an unapproved wind chime, said it created a chaotic auditory environment. And now here she was, claiming my backyard like it was Normandy on D-Day. I chuckled, not because it was funny, but because it was so ludicrous it felt like satire. No, I said, one word, flat, final. But Karen isn't built to hear no. Her eyes twitched like a slot machine on tilt. Frank, the HOA rules state that common areas. I cut her off. This isn't a common area, Karen. It's my private property, paid for with my pension and 3 decades of backbreaking work. You want a venue? Rent a hall. Her nostrils flared like she was about to charge me. This attitude, she snapped, is why no one comes to your holiday potlucks. That's because I serve food that wasn't cooked in passive aggression, I replied. That afternoon, I found an official-looking letter taped to my front door. A choice seal, clearly Karen's handwriting. It was a community concern report stating that I was displaying signs of antisocial behavior and resistance to community unity. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped my soup spoon. Apparently, refusing to surrender your backyard for a wedding you weren't invited to now counted as psychological dysfunction. Later that evening, I heard them, neighbors whispering, texting, peeking through curtains like we were back in Cold War Russia. I became the neighborhood pariah overnight. One woman who always borrowed my rake wouldn't make eye contact. A kid on a bike swerved to avoid my driveway like I was contagious. All because I wouldn't roll over for Queen Karen's backyard fantasy. So I did what any rational man would do. I walked out to my barn and sat with my cows, Daisy and Buttercup. They didn't care about HOA bylaws. They just wanted hay and an occasional scratch behind the ears. I vented to them like old friends, telling them how the neighborhood had turned into a soap opera with fewer teeth and more pettiness. Buttercup sneezed on my boot. It felt like solidarity. The next day, Karen wasn't just back. She brought reinforcements. For women with folding chairs and iced matcha lattes were touring my lawn like it was a wedding venue. One pointed at my flower beds and said, "We can do the photo booth there." I marched out in my robe and slippers. "Unless you're planting flowers or milking cows, you're trespassing," I growled. Karen turned, all sugar-coated venom. "Frank, please don't make this harder than it needs to be." The audacity was almost poetic. I asked them to leave. Karen refused. She said she had legal rights. I told her the only thing she had was a misunderstanding of property law and an inflated sense of self-worth. The ladies huffed off, muttering about how I used to be nice. That night, the HOA newsletter came out digitally. On the front page, elderly neighbor blocks community wedding an act of malice, complete with a Photoshop picture of me frowning next to a tombstone. I have never laughed harder and wanted to scream more in my life. By now, it wasn't about the backyard. It was about principle, about standing up to people who used rules as weapons and kindness as leverage. Karen's power trip had gone unchecked for too long. She'd fined people for lawn gnomes, tried to ban Halloween decorations for being unwholesome, and once tried to evict a widowed vet because his mailbox was the wrong shade of beige. I had let a lot of things slide, but not this. Not my backyard. Not my sanctuary. So, I called an emergency meeting. The HOA bylaws said any 3 residents could demand one. Grace, my neighbor across the street, a retired attorney with a scowl sharper than her tongue, agreed to co-host. Marvin, the conspiracy nut who believed Karen was a government sleeper agent, signed on eagerly. We printed flyers and slid them under doors. When Karen saw them, she smiled like the villain in a Disney movie. "You're only making this worse for yourself," she said. "What's next, Frank? Are you going to sue me over some cows?" I paused. A spark lit in my brain. "Maybe," I said slowly. "Maybe I'll do just that." She didn't know it yet, but she had just given me an idea that would turn her precious wedding into the most unforgettable event this neighborhood had ever seen. Because if Karen wanted a backyard showdown, she was going to get one. And the guests of honor? Daisy and Buttercup, my cows. And they don't RSVP, they crash. The day after the HOA flyer dropped, I woke up to a front yard that looked like a Cold War propaganda zone. Someone had placed little lawn signs around my property that read things like "Danger," "Hostile Resident," and "Love Doesn't Live Here." I wouldn't put it past Karen to have printed them herself in her living room, sipping chamomile tea while labeling me as a threat to neighborhood happiness. I chuckled as I pulled them out one by one, stacking them on the porch like trophies. Buttercup followed me around, lazily mooing like she agreed with the slander. Daisy, ever the rebel, nudged one of the signs and promptly sat on it. Later that morning, I sat on the porch with a piece of toast and a glass of orange juice, venting to the only audience that still respected me, my cows. "Can you believe this?" I asked Daisy, who responded by licking her nose and flopping onto her side. "They want to turn our backyard into a wedding circus and expect me to hand over the keys like it's some Airbnb for emotionally constipated brides." Buttercup swished her tail in solidarity. These cows were my calm in the storm, my emotional support livestock. I'd raised them after my wife passed away. She always loved the idea of a quiet life with a small farm, and those two big-eyed troublemakers were the last pieces of her dream still breathing. Mid-chew, I spotted Marvin creeping across the lawn like a trench-coated squirrel. He was wearing a baseball cap that said surveillance mode on and holding a walkie-talkie like he was part of some underground militia. "They're planning something," he whispered, crouching behind a bush that barely covered his beer belly. "Karen met with the florist last night." I picked up chatter. "They're installing a pergola on Thursday. We're running out of time." Marvin had a flair for the dramatic, but I had to admit, his intel was always weirdly accurate. "Thanks, soldier," I told him. "Stay in the shadows." He nodded solemnly and rolled away on a scooter he'd modified to be stealth mode. The wheels squeaked every 2 feet. That evening, I met with Grace in her kitchen. Her house smelled like menthol and vengeance. She laid out a stack of legal documents thicker than a Bible. "I've reviewed the HOA charter front to back. There's a clause about common space access, but nothing about forced private property use." She's bluffing. Grace wore reading glasses and a permanent scowl, like the world had been disappointing her since 1974. "But," she added, "we're dealing with Karen. She'll twist words like a balloon artist on caffeine, so we need leverage." I glanced at the photos on Grace's fridge. Her late husband was a Marine, and she'd been a lawyer in 3 states. That explained the no-nonsense attitude and the way she kept a gavel on her kitchen counter. I told her about the cow idea, half as a joke, but her eyes lit up like someone had just offered her front-row tickets to a neighborhood meltdown. "Frank," she said slowly, "if those cows just so happened to wander onto your property on wedding day, I'm not entirely sure the HOA would have jurisdiction over that." "Accidents happen," I replied with a grin. "Accidents moo loudly and eat expensive roses." The next morning, I began Operation Mayhem. I built a small path of hay and treats that led from the barn to the part of the yard where Karen had marked ceremony seating with white flags. Buttercup caught on quickly. Daisy was more skeptical, but eventually followed her sister's lead. I trained them like old circus performers, reinforcing their loyalty with apples and scratches behind the ears. Every time they completed the trail, I'd clap like a proud coach at a cow Olympics. The girls were ready. Meanwhile, the community was boiling. Neighbors began choosing sides like it was a custody battle. Some backed Karen, convinced by her sob story about how her niece's father had cancer, and this wedding was his last chance to walk her down the aisle. A compelling narrative, except he was spotted jogging 2 blocks over, very much alive and aggressively healthy. Others, mostly the ones Karen had fined in the past, rallied behind me. I became a sort of neighborhood anti-hero. An older woman left a pie on my porch with a note that read, "Keep fighting the good fight." Another slipped a cowbell into my mailbox. Marvin tried to start a militia, but I told him to cool it before someone brought out actual pitchforks. Karen, never one to let her power wane, called for a public HOA meeting. She booked the community center, passed out flyers, and even offered cupcakes to lure in the undecided. The turnout was larger than expected. Grace and I arrived early, armed with printouts, photos, and a small slideshow of Karen's most ridiculous rule enforcement. One of them included a real fine she'd issued to a woman for having a bird bath that encouraged wildlife loitering. Karen strutted in like a politician at a rally, her niece in tow, looking like she wanted to be anywhere else. Karen opened the floor with a speech about unity, compassion, and the importance of community spaces. Then she looked at me and said, "Some people, however, prefer to hoard their resources like dragons in a cave." I leaned forward in my seat and said, "Better a dragon than a wedding planner with a god complex." That got a few laughs. Even the niece smirked. Grace took the floor and shredded Karen's claims with surgical precision. She quoted bylaws, played voicemail clips, and at one point, dramatically pulled out a copy of the U.S. Constitution, saying, "Nowhere in here does it say you can annex a backyard for a Pinterest-themed nightmare." The room erupted, but Karen wasn't done. She whipped out a letter allegedly signed by 10 neighbors supporting her. Upon closer inspection, 2 of the signatures were from deceased residents. One was a dog named Waffles, and another appeared to be in crayon. I leaned over and whispered to Grace, "Waffles is very politically active." Karen's face began to crack. Her carefully constructed image of authority was crumbling like a poorly baked souffle. She yelled something about defamation and stormed out, niece in tow. Back at home, I sat under the oak tree with Daisy and Buttercup. They nuzzled me like loyal soldiers awaiting orders. I knew Karen wasn't finished, but neither was I. The battle lines were clear now. The wedding was scheduled for Sunday. The stage was set. My cows were trained. The community was divided. And I was no longer just frank with the backyard. I was frank with a plan. The days leading up to Sunday were tense. My quiet little slice of the world had become the epicenter of an all-out suburban showdown. Every time I stepped outside, I could feel the eyes of the neighborhood on me, as if I were the protagonist in some daytime soap opera none of them had asked to be part of, but were now hopelessly invested in. I'd overheard whispered conversations at the corner store, caught long glances from folks walking their dogs, and even the mailman, who normally had a cheerful hello, now gave me the kind of look usually reserved for bomb diffusers. There was something surreal about watching your backyard turn into the battleground of a passive-aggressive war, with folding chairs as weapons and floral centerpieces as landmines. But through it all, I kept my cool. I had a plan, and more importantly, I had the cows. What Karen didn't understand was that this wasn't just about a wedding. This was about respect, about boundaries, about not letting people walk all over you just because they think they can smile while doing it. Karen had built her little HOA kingdom on manipulation and fear, and I had let her get away with it for too long. But not anymore. Not since she decided to invade my backyard and expect me to smile while she did it. That Friday, 2 days before the wedding, I found myself sitting with my grandkids in the living room. They were visiting for the weekend, dropped off by my daughter who was heading out of town. The oldest, Emily, was 12 and already sharper than most adults I knew. She asked me straight up, "Grandpa, why are people mad at you?" I sighed, debating how much to tell her. But she looked at me with those big eyes full of curiosity and concern, and I couldn't lie. I told her everything, from Karen's surprise declaration to the fake signatures to the plan involving Daisy and Buttercup. She didn't laugh like I expected. She just nodded, then said something that stuck with me. "That's kind of sad. Weddings are supposed to make people happy, not angry." I sat there for a moment, chewing on that thought like a tough piece of jerky. She was right. Somewhere in the middle of defending my rights and cooking up a comedy of chaos, I'd forgotten the core of what this whole mess had started around: someone's wedding. Even if Karen had twisted it into a neighborhood hostage situation, there was still a young woman caught in the crossfire. And from what I could tell, she wasn't thrilled about it either. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because I was nervous. No, I was well past nerves. But because I kept thinking about the bride, Karen's niece. I didn't even know her name. She'd been quiet through all of this, almost ghost-like, like she was watching everything from behind a sheet of plastic. I remembered seeing her face at the HOA meeting, how tired she looked, like this wasn't her celebration but someone else's performance. It made me pause. Maybe the cows didn't need to wreck the whole thing. Maybe just rattle it a bit, enough to make a point, not enough to ruin someone's big day. Saturday came, and with it, the wedding rehearsal. I watched from my kitchen window as Karen and her bridal brigade set up folding chairs in my yard like they owned the deed. There were tiki torches, streamers, a suspiciously expensive-looking archway, and a team of people hauling in coolers and table linens. The audacity was mesmerizing. I walked outside and leaned against the fence. Karen saw me but pretended not to. Her niece gave me a small, embarrassed smile before going back to adjusting place cards. I could hear Karen barking orders. No, no, the flowers go here. And someone tell the caterers not to park near the barn. That man has animals. I muttered. They have names. Daisy mooed from inside the barn like she was backing me up. Grace showed up around noon with a picnic basket and a wicked grin. Ready for tomorrow? She asked, handing me a sandwich. I have statements prepared in case she tries to sue you for emotional distress. Also, Marvin's rigged the sprinkler system to go off if she crosses the fence line. I smiled, appreciating her enthusiasm, but the conversation with my granddaughter still lingered in my mind. I told Grace I was thinking about changing the plan slightly. Less mayhem, more message. She didn't argue. She understood better than anyone that sometimes the strongest punch is the one you pull back at the last second. As the sun dipped behind the houses, casting long shadows across my yard, I did one final walkthrough with Daisy and Buttercup. I gave them extra treats and whispered to them like they were co-conspirators in a heist. Now remember, girls, nice and slow, straight down the path. No trampling, just gentle disruption. Buttercup snorted like she understood the assignment. Then came the final night before the wedding. I sat alone under the oak tree, thinking about my wife. She would have laughed at all of this. She'd always told me not to let people push me around, but she also had a soft spot for second chances and happy endings. I imagined her saying, "Make your point, Frank, but don't be cruel." That sealed it. I'd let the cows make an appearance, just enough to ruffle some feathers and maybe, just maybe, steer the shipwreck of a wedding back on course. I went to bed with a strange calm, the kind of calm that comes when you've decided you'll do the right thing, even if it's not the easy thing. Tomorrow was going to be a circus, no doubt, but I had the main acts ready, the audience divided, and a surprise twist in my pocket. The backyard was prepped, the cows were fed, and my porch light was off. Let Karen believe she'd won. Let her think her kingdom was intact. Because by tomorrow evening, whether she liked it or not, everything was about to change. And it wouldn't be because of war, it would be because of wisdom. Because sometimes the loudest message isn't delivered with yelling, it's delivered with a moo. Sunday morning arrived like the calm before a hurricane. The sky was blue, birds were chirping, and if you didn't know any better, you'd think the neighborhood was at peace. But beneath that peaceful surface, battle lines were drawn, alliances were firm, and I, Frank with the cows, was ready to make suburban history. I brewed my coffee slower than usual, savoring the final quiet hours before the absurdity began. From my kitchen window, I watched as cars lined up along the street. Guests in pastel dresses and ill-fitting suits stepped out with wrapped gifts and awkward smiles. Karen was everywhere at once, stomping through my backyard in a beige dress suit and barking orders like a field commander. Her voice echoed across my lawn, demanding perfection. Move those chairs 3 inches to the left. No, my left. And for heaven's sake, someone get rid of that smell. It smells like cow out here. That smell, by the way, was intentional. Buttercup had done her part. A little gift near the rose trellis. Subtle, but meaningful. I wasn't above a little symbolism. I stepped outside with my coffee and leaned on the railing, watching the chaos unfold like it was an overpriced theater performance. Karen spotted me, narrowed her eyes, and marched toward me with the energy of someone whose too unpaid finds a way from a nervous breakdown. "Frank, I don't want any trouble today," she said, teeth clenched behind a smile. "It's my niece's special day. We've come too far for you to ruin it." I nodded, polite and calm. "You have my word," I said. "No trouble for me." She studied me, trying to figure out if I was bluffing. I wasn't, not technically. Around noon, the ceremony setup was complete. Rows of white chairs sat facing a wooden arch draped in lace and fake flowers. A sound system had been dragged in, and there were speakers tied to my trees. My trees. The audacity never stopped. Guests milled around, sipping lemonade and fanning themselves with printed wedding programs that I noticed did not mention the venue by name, probably because Frank's backyard, against his will, didn't have the ring they were going for. I saw Karen's niece, Alyssa, I'd finally learned her name, standing awkwardly near the back door of my house, talking to the officiant. She looked like someone who had smiled too much and meant none of it. Her eyes met mine for a second, and I gave her a small nod. She returned it, almost like a thank you, or maybe a warning. Hard to tell. Then came the music. The ceremony was starting. Karen strutted down the aisle like she was the one getting married, beaming as guests snapped photos and whispered admiration. Alyssa followed behind, her dress beautiful and her expression tragic. I waited. The cows were still in the barn, resting. Buttercup was licking a salt block. Daisy was chewing cud with a look of meditative calm. They were ready. At the right moment, I opened the gate and dropped a small trail of apple slices. Slowly, deliberately, the girls began their procession. I walked with them for a few feet, whispering encouragement like a proud coach sending his athletes into the arena. They ambled forward, calm and curious, following the scent of snacks and adventure. Just as the officiant reached the part about forever holding your peace, a low, satisfied moo rolled across the backyard. Every head turned. Daisy appeared first, stepping gently between the chairs, her tail flicking flies and her eyes scanning the scene like she was judging the decor. Buttercup followed close behind, faster and hungrier, and within seconds, they were in the middle of the aisle, standing beside the arch like confused bridesmaids. The silence was glorious. No one moved. Karen's mouth opened, closed, then opened again like a malfunctioning animatronic. "Frank!" she shrieked, running toward the altar. "Get them out. Get them out right now." I raised my hands innocently. I didn't let them out. They just followed the scent of community unity. A few guests chuckled. Someone took a photo. Daisy stepped on a table leg and knocked over a tray of mini sandwiches. Buttercup took a bite out of one of the fake flower arrangements. Pure chaos. Pure magic. Then came the yelling. Karen's voice reached new heights of shrillness as she tried to herd 2 full-grown cows in heels. She waved her arms, tripped over a speaker cord, and landed in a pile of folding chairs. Marvin, watching from his roof, yelled, "This is better than cable." Grace recorded the whole thing on her phone, muttering something about uploading it to the HOA Facebook page with the caption, "Nature fights back." I was about to walk away, satisfied, when I caught sight of Alyssa. She was crying. Not dramatic Karen-style crying, but quiet, real tears. Her hands trembled as she stood there in the middle of the wedding wreckage. The guests weren't paying attention to her at all. They were watching Karen scream and the cows meander and eat tablecloths. The bride was invisible at her own wedding. That did something to me. I walked over slowly, carefully stepping around a crushed plate of canapes. I tapped Alyssa on the shoulder. "You all right?" I asked gently. She shook her head. "I didn't want any of this," she whispered. "I just wanted something small." Karen said she'd handle everything, but she made it about herself. I didn't even want it here. I didn't even ask. She looked so broken, standing there in a dress that didn't suit her, at a wedding that wasn't hers. I sighed. All the humor drained from me like water from a cracked pot. The cows had done their job, sure. They'd crashed the wedding. But now I had a mess to clean up, a real one. Not for Karen, for the girl in the white dress who didn't deserve this circus. I turned to Grace, gave her a nod, and she stepped in. Together, with a little help from Marvin and a few guests who still had their wits about them, we guided the cows back to the barn. I gave them each a treat, patted their heads, and whispered, "You were brilliant." Then I walked back to the crowd, clapped my hands, and said, "All right, folks, let's salvage this day." Karen tried to protest, but this time, no one listened. People were tired. They wanted something real. So I offered something real. I opened the barn doors and said, "The inside's clean, rustic, and smells only slightly of hay. We've got string lights and benches and enough space to host the vows without another stampede." Alyssa looked at me with wide, teary eyes. "Are you serious?" I nodded. "It's your wedding. Let's make it yours." And just like that, the tide turned. The guests followed Alyssa into the barn. Karen stood alone in the wreckage, mascara running, voice lost, power gone. And I walked into that barn, not as the villain she tried to paint me as, but as the man who let his cows crash the party just long enough to give the bride a chance to take it back. The barn glowed with a soft, golden light as the last of the wedding guests found their seats on the hay bale benches. The string lights that I had strung up months ago, never expecting they'd one day become wedding decor, flickered gently overhead. Alyssa stood at the makeshift altar at the far end, beneath a simple arch of sunflowers and old wood that I had built with my late wife back when we used the barn for summer cookouts. The dust in the air caught the light like magic, and the old place had never looked more beautiful. There wasn't a fancy aisle or rose petals or a seven-tier cake, but there was laughter, music, and for the first time all day joy. Real joy. And all of it felt earned. I leaned against the side of the barn, watching the ceremony unfold. Alyssa looked calm now, grounded, like she was finally part of her own story instead of just a prop in Karen's show. The groom, a quiet, sweet-looking guy named Jeremy, stood beside her with his hand in hers like he was afraid to blink in case it all disappeared. The officiant cleared his throat, cracked a small joke about how the best weddings come with a little livestock drama, and everyone laughed, even Alyssa. It was the kind of laughter that cracked something open, not the polite kind, the kind that sticks. Karen was nowhere in sight. Last I saw, she was storming off down the street, clutching her phone and muttering something about calling the HOA board for an emergency vote. But I had a feeling even her loyal minions were tired of the show. The people who stayed behind in the barn were the ones who mattered. The ones who understood that rules don't mean anything without heart. That sometimes you have to break a few chairs and maybe let a cow eat a bouquet to find something real. After the ceremony ended, we pushed the benches aside, and someone turned on a Bluetooth speaker that started playing old country hits. It wasn't elegant, but it was warm, familiar, the kind of celebration that felt like family even among strangers. People danced in worn boots and mismatched shoes. Someone brought out a pie, and Grace passed around cups of sweet tea like a matriarch at a summer picnic. I ended up sitting beside Alyssa on a bench near the barn door, the air cooling as the sun finally dipped behind the rooftops. She looked at me and smiled, small and genuine. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I don't even know what to say. You could have ruined everything. You kind of did, actually. But then you saved it too." I nodded slowly. "You didn't deserve what you tried to make this. I saw your face during the ceremony. That wasn't joy. That was survival." She laughed, a little bitterly. "It's been like that my whole life with her. Karen always knows what's best for everyone, whether they want it or not." She looked at me again. "But today, you gave me the best gift. You gave me back my voice." I didn't have a response for that, just a heavy feeling in my chest, the good kind, the kind that reminded me I still had purpose, even after retirement, even after loss. I reached down and scratched Daisy behind the ears as she ambled over to us, tail flicking happily. Buttercup followed, licking the remnants of someone's paper plate. The guests laughed and welcomed the cows like old friends. Kids climbed on hay bales, someone started singing off-key, and for a few moments, everything just felt right. Later that evening, after the last slice of pie had been eaten and the final song played, I stood under the stars with Grace and Marvin, watching as guests trickled out with hugs and thank yous. Marvin clapped me on the back and muttered, "You did good, Frank. Better than good. You turned chaos into something beautiful. That's a kind of magic, you know." Grace, in her usual dry tone, added, "And probably illegal in 7 states, but definitely magical." I smiled, letting the night settle in around me. As I walked Grace back to her house, we passed the spot where the ceremony had originally been set up. The arch was still there, a little crooked now, one of the decorations half-eaten by Buttercup. It looked ridiculous and beautiful all at once. I bent down, picked up a piece of torn lace, and tucked it into my pocket without thinking. Maybe it would remind me of today, when the porch swing got too quiet. The next morning, I woke up to an email from the HOA. It was a formal notice that Karen had been temporarily relieved of her presidential duties pending a community vote. Apparently, someone had uploaded a video compilation of her yelling during the wedding, edited with dramatic music and captions. It had gone semi-viral on the neighborhood Facebook page. The top comment was, "Is this lady for real?" with over 100 likes. I clicked on the video. At the 2-minute mark, Karen was seen swatting at Buttercup while screaming about velvet chair covers. I chuckled and closed the laptop. A few days later, I was sitting on the porch again when Karen walked up the driveway. No clipboard, no posse, just her, looking smaller than usual. She stopped at the steps, glanced at Daisy in the yard, then looked up at me. "Frank," she said quietly, "I owe you an apology." I said nothing, just waited. I got carried away. I thought I was helping Alyssa, but I guess I was helping myself, trying to control everything. "You were right to stand your ground. I was wrong to bulldoze over you. And I'm sorry." For a moment, I didn't know what to say. Then I stood up and walked down the steps slowly, carefully. "Karen," I said, You drive me nuts. You turn mailboxes into battlefields and throw HOA notices like confetti. But that girl deserved better, and whether you meant to or not, you almost stole her joy. I'm not mad about the wedding. I'm mad it took cows for you to see the damage you were doing. She nodded, embarrassed. I get it, and I don't expect forgiveness. But I do want to change. I looked at her, trying to gauge if this was a performance or something real, and for once, I saw something honest in her eyes, a flicker of humility. I sighed. Change starts with listening. Maybe try that before the next neighborhood war. She smiled faintly. Deal. As she turned to leave, I called out, by the way, HOA is voting next week. You running again? She shook her head. No, I think I'll sit this one out. Let someone else take the reins. Good, I said, because Daisy's considering running. Her approval ratings are through the roof. She laughed, for real this time, and walked away. I turned back toward my porch, took my seat, and watched the cows graze peacefully. The backyard was quiet again. No decorations, no guests, no shouting. Just the wind in the trees and the soft sounds of a world returning to normal. I sipped my coffee and smiled to myself. Karen tried to take my backyard for a wedding, so I let my cows crash the party. But in the end, we all got something better. A reminder that sometimes standing your ground isn't about being stubborn. It's about protecting peace. And maybe, if you're lucky, it's about helping others find theirs.